Good evening, I'm Barbara Wawa. Welcome to this edition of 2020. Tonight we explore Europe, the financial crisis of today and the Europe of the year 2020. We'll hear from 3 reporters in the field as we investigate the story of Europe, 2020. First, let's turn to John Doe for an overview of the European financial crisis of the last few years. John?
Thank you. This is John Doe coming to you from Brussels. According to Peter Stanners from the Copenhagen Post, the financial crisis in Europe has to do with the fear that some countries may be unable to pay back their debt. Governments were able to borrow money cheaply during the last decade. When countries can't pay back those loans, they default on their debts just as individuals do when declaring bankruptcy. In 2002, Argentina defaulted on almost $100 billion of debt owed to the World Bank, unemployment soared to 25%, GDP dropped by over 10% and the Argentine peso lost half its value overnight. This is the scenario that European leaders wanted to avoid when in 2009 concerns started to mount over Greece's ability to pay off its debt. Since becoming a democracy in 1974, Greece had run a high government deficit to pay for a large public sector that offered high wages and generous pensions. Greece witnessed healthy economic growth in spite of maintaining a debt level close to 100% of its GDP. Zsolt Darvas from Bruegel, a Brussels-based think tank, said Greece's problems started when they hid their actual level of debt in order to be allowed entry into the Eurozone. Darvas said,
Greece was just fiscally irresponsible. They lied about their numbers, they lied to get inside the Eurozone, and they didn't use the good times to prepare for an economic downturn.
The global financial crisis 2008 affected Greece's economy. But unlike some countries that tightened their belts to cope, Greece was unprepared. As Greece's income shrank, its debt rose. By 2010 its debt had risen from 100 to 145% of its GDP. Greece's debt crisis affected the economies of the countries from whom it borrowed funds. Despite pledges to cut public spending, Greece was eventually forced to start accepting bailouts in 2010, even though accepting over 110 billion euros in loans to balance its books. European leaders made the drastic decision to forgive half of Greece's debt. Some economists suggested Greece should leave the Eurozone. If Greece dropped out of the Eurozone, the ramifications would be far-reaching due to the interconnectedness of global economies. According to Diego Valiant,
we have discovered that the financial system is enormous and is just too big and interconnected to fail. We have to save the financial system from a collapse which would have repercussions on the economies and competitiveness of countries.
If Greece defaulted, then banks across Europe who bought billions of euros of Greek debt, because it was considered safe, would suddenly have been left with worthless assets. Other banks, unsure of who has bought Greek debt, would then start calling in debts. While Italy, Portugal and Ireland all faced similar debt problems, Greece's problems demonstrate the primary issues. European governments borrowed too much money while times were good, and as the global economy shrank in 2008, those unable to adjust their public finances were left scrambling to pay back their debts. The financial crisis was twofold. First, countries didn't control their own debt. Additionally, banks' willingness to risk assets in cheap and risky lending deepened the inability to repay those loans. Barbara, back to you.
Thank you, John. Now we'll turn to Brenda Morris for a glimpse into the future. Brenda, what can you tell us about possible European unification?
Thank you. This is Brenda Morris reporting from Berlin. Europe has long been an area of international conflict. Wars over borders, religion, and regional conquest have racked the region for centuries. Throughout history, major portions of Europe have been unified under one conqueror or another. Charlemagne in 814, Napoleon in 1810, Hitler in 1942. After World War II, calls to unify Europe to prevent further wars began. Winston Churchill said in 1946,
"There is a remedy which would in a few years make all Europe free and happy. It is to recreate the European family, or as much of it as we can, and to provide it with a structure under which it can dwell in peace, in safety and in freedom. We must build a kind of United States of Europe.
By the end of 1992, the Maastricht Treaty on European Union was signed, creating three pillars: the European Communities, the Common Foreign and Security Policy, CFSP, and Police and Judicial Cooperation in Criminal Matters, the Justice and Home Affairs, JHA. The treaty introduces the concept of European citizenship, reinforces the powers of the European Parliament and launches the Economic and Monetary Union, EMU. The euro currency came into existence in 1999. By 2002 it had replaced the national currency of 12 countries. On June 17, 2010, the European Council met in Brussels to formulate the priorities for Europe moving into the future. The European Council finalized the European Union's new strategy for jobs and smart, sustainable and inclusive growth. This strategy will help Europe recover from the crisis and come out stronger, both internally and at the international level, by boosting competitiveness, productivity, growth potential, social cohesion and economic convergence. There are 5 EU headline targets which constitute shared objectives to guide the action of member states and the Union regarding promoting employment, improving the conditions for innovation, research and development, meeting our climate change and energy objectives, improving education levels and promoting social inclusion, in particular through the reduction of poverty. On March 17, 2013, the President of the European Commission, José Manuel Durão Barroso, addressed the summit of the Lisbon Council for the third time in Brussels.
To overcome the fiscal crisis in a sustainable way and to restore confidence,
we need indeed to give tangible proof of the willingness and capacity of the Europeans to move forward, together, in a decisive way through the strengthening of the architecture in the financial, fiscal, economic and also political domains.
Dr. Florin Bonsiu, a professor with the Romanian American University in Bucharest, examined the concept of a United States of Europe. Dr. Bonsiu, thank you taking the time to speak with me. You wrote an interesting paper on the conceivability of the United States of Europe.
A federation of states would allow for the most effective and efficient use of resources. Not to mention the coherence that a federal state would bring to the use of a single currency. If we discussed the subject in a laboratory, that is in pure theory, with no strings attached, with controlled inputs and rational behavior of people and governments, I fully agree to such an approach.
But we don't live in a laboratory.
No, we don't. So, if we start from where we are, which is reality, given the historical, cultural, social, economic and political roots of the European states and communities, a federation in the sense of a federal state is not possible. And, even if it became a possibility, the consequences would be terrible and it would not last. It is interesting to note that both views look to the United States of America for support of their arguments.
So would a United States of Europe look like the United States of America?
Many of the arguments in favor of the United States of Europe start from this analogy. The first approach handpicks certain characteristics of the American Federation to support the idea of a united Europe. The second one looks at the whole picture and points to the fundamental differences between the real United States of America and the hypothetical United States of Europe. In order to have a clearer picture, let us have a look at some of the differences. The United States of America is a country, a federation of states that started from zero on a new land. The European countries have a very long history and some guesses of millennia, specific to each country, and they are here, on their homeland with their ancestors, their habits, their culture and their languages.
In your opinion, what brought about this interest in uniting Europe?
Some EU member states, particularly Greece, but also Spain, Portugal, Ireland and Italy, have had severe debt problems. The European decision-makers were confronted with a too-big-to-fail dilemma. The first theoretical option has been considered a no real-life option. The second option raised two issues. The first was how to make the whole deal acceptable for Germany.
Why is it so important that Germany accept the proposal?
Europe would have to underwrite mainly by Germany, the debts of the mentioned countries that are worth about $1,000 billion. If Germany is to come to the rescue, then Germany needs some guarantees and safeguards that the countries in need today would be able someday to repay the debts. These guarantees and safeguards took the form of the proposal regarding the transfer of the control over budgets and fiscal policies to the Central Eurozone Authority.
And what is the second issue?
How to avoid this situation in the future. A Central Eurozone Authority was again the answer. Logically, to avoid further disequilibrium in the economies of the EU member states, a centrally coordinated mechanism should be established. This is to monitor the balance of macroeconomic indicators and to correlate the national policies with national and community financial balances.
We'll be back in a moment with more of Brenda Morris's interview with Dr. Bensiu.